Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by John P. White, MVP Tygraph Canada, who will be talking to you today about a place for our stuff, Introduction to Power BI Dataflows. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC20. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. Type any questions you have for John in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, John P. White. Hello, John. Oh, I'll just unmute you there. John, can you hear me?
I think I unmuted the same time you unmuted me. Thanks very much, Shane. I'm thrilled to be with you here today. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you just throw me the presenter? There we go.
Go for it.
I'm gonna hit it. There we go. Show my screen. All right. And if you could just let me know, I'm gonna go into presentation mode.
Yep, I can see your Power BI dashboard, John.
Yeah, and you now should see a slide says a place for our stuff.
Take it away.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for joining. Frankly, I'm floored by the level of enthusiasm in this particular topic, which is, well, kind of esoteric even in the Power BI world. So I'm going to try to keep it. I'm going to assume some people are just particularly interested in the Power BI aspect. So I'm going to try to focus in on a few of the basics as well. So if I cover some stuff you've already known, please excuse me. We're going to be talking about Dataflows in Power BI today. And just a couple of things to note. You see the QR code on the screen, and you'll see it at the bottom of the screen as we go through the slides. You'll see it on a lot of the slides, as well as a link on the bottom left-hand side. If you go there, you'll be taken to a form that you can fill out. And it's sometimes used for a demo, but it's really used right now just so we can send you the deck. So you're going to get a copy of the slides if you want to fill that out. One of the questions is going to be, are you interested in Tygraph, which is our company's product? If you're not interested, just say no. But if you are interested, say yes, and we'll send you some information on. That's all that's going to happen with your email. So that's what it gets used for. Just to get going, my name's John White. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Tygraph, or the company's name is actually Unlimited Biz, but we make Tygraph. We've been doing that for quite a while now. I'm an Office Apps and Services MVP, as well as a data platform MVP. So I've been a dually for a few years now as well. So kind of came up through the SharePoint world, was always interested in business intelligence. And have really embraced Power BI as it's changed over the last 6 years, 7 years now is really how old that brand is. That's my information there, jpw.limitedbiz.com, my blog, and my Twitter handle. So if you'll notice the picture, that is in fact me in the picture. One of the few pictures in this deck that I haven't taken. It was taken by my son. And it kind of explains that rather odd Twitter handle, but my name being John White, I had to come up with something slightly creative that wasn't already used. So you know what I'd like to do, and you know how old I am. In addition, I host, along with my friend Jason Himmelstein, a podcast called Bifocal. We try to do it once a week, bringing you the news from the business intelligence and in particular Power BI world from Microsoft. We get guests on from time to time. We'll cover off the monthly desktop drops. We just had a special episode last week where we covered the Microsoft Business Application Summit, all of the announcements there. So enough by way of introduction. Our agenda for today, and I also want to point out, Shane's going to monitor the Q&A window. So if you got questions, please chime in with those questions. Depending on the volume, Shane's going to figure out whether or not or where it would be appropriate to step in. But I don't like to leave anybody behind. So if you've got questions, please ask them. I like to engage with the audience. It's a lot easier to do this, obviously, in an in-person event than a webinar. But this is how we're dealing with things these days. So to start with, we're going to talk about what a Power BI data flow is. I think there's generally, even now, there's still some confusion as to what its purpose is in the Power BI space. And then I'm going to show you some of the differences when we use data flows. We're going to talk about as well some of the advanced features of data flows, and depending on time, we'll get into a couple of demos there. Oh, have we got a question, Shane? Or do we? I just heard you. Okay, I heard somebody anyway. Okay.
Questions?
All right. And then we're going to just talk a little bit about how to turn data flows on and how to administer them in the service. And then finally, we'll just have a quick wrap up. All right. So to start with, what is a Power BI data flow? To answer that question, I like to go back in time a little bit. It's not really back in time, but this really describes enterprise business intelligence as a whole. This is a slide I've used throughout my speaking career, really, because it's something that we've had for a long time, and it still is the fundamental architectural underpinnings of any business intelligence system. And at its root, we have data, and we want to get knowledge from our data. We need to gain insights from our data. But the first thing we have to do is to get that data out of where it's currently stored, as opposed to going to it. That's one of the fundamental tenets of business intelligence. We don't want to report on data in place. So we need to get data out of where it is stored and into some centralized mechanism of some sort. So we call these things data warehouses. They're really just databases. They're clearinghouse databases. We can then distribute that data into other databases that are designed for the purpose. It might be designed for reporting. It might be designed for import into a multidimensional system like SQL Server Analysis Services. So multidimensional storage is just storing the data in a different way that supports slicing and dicing of the data. The ability to look at, say, a sales number and then figure out how does that split out by country or by sales rep or by product or all of the above. That's multidimensional analysis. And then we typically will have different mechanisms that connect to these middle data repositories. We can have servers like reporting services historically. SharePoint has historically, on premises at the very least, been a middleware server where you can, it is the broker between the user and the data. And as well, you can, of course, have clients that are connecting back to these different data sources. And in the enterprise space, Microsoft's products around this are SQL Server. They basically, it hosts the data marts and the data warehouses. Again, they're just databases of a particular design. The tool that is used to get the data from its source and into one of these data warehouses or data marts is SQL Server Integration Services. This is all part of SQL Server when you buy it. Integration services is one of the least known tools, but probably one of the most useful tools in the whole stack. And then finally, our multidimensional analysis needs have been met by SQL Server Analysis Services. And that creates cubes and now what we call data models or data sets in Power BI. And Analysis Services is the underpinning for Power BI itself. All right, so with that set aside, there's a variation of that when we use Power BI, and in particular, Power BI Desktop. So Power BI Desktop is our design tool when we're using Power BI. It's not the client tool. It's not the client version of what we get in the service. I think it's poorly named. Power BI Desktop really should have been called Power BI Designer, because it's the tool that you use to put together your reports, to gather your data, and to do your multidimensional analysis. So it contains all of those elements of the enterprise BI, or a lot of those elements of the enterprise BI that we just saw. So on the ETL, extract, transform, and load side, what would have been performed by SSIS in the previous slide, we have Power Query. And Power Query is a set of tools that let us connect to source data and transform it the way we want, essentially bringing it into a data warehouse. Power Pivot, it historically is baked into Power BI Desktop. It's also, you also heard referred to as DAX, D-A-X. And that's where we can go and build our calculated measures and our calculated columns and do our analysis in aggregate across rows of data. And it also contains our report designer, so we can drag and drop these elements onto a screen and start to build out these highly functional reports, often referred to as dashboards, but in the world of Power BI, a dashboard is a different thing. So I try not to use the term, but essentially this is where we're going to build the interface that the users are going to interact with. But all that is encapsulated within Power BI Desktop, and that's the way it's been for quite some time. And the way that works from a design standpoint is you'll have this tool on your on your desktop, Power BI Desktop, and you're going to use Power Query to reach out to these different data sources. And those data sources may be on premises. On the left-hand side, the implication is that they are, or that data may be in the cloud, whether it's through a file source in the cloud, or whether it's a database in the cloud, or whether it's just a web page in the cloud. And we're going to build up our data model or our data set, you can refer to them the same way, within Power BI Desktop. And we're ready, we deploy that data set to the Power BI service. And when we publish to Power BI, a couple of things are happening. That data set is moving from our desktop file into the service that Microsoft hosts called Power BI. And that data set itself is being stored in analysis services. That's happening behind the scenes. You don't have to manage it. You don't even have to know it's there. And frankly, I don't know that Microsoft wants you to know it's there that badly, but it's the engine that's in behind Power BI Desktop. So the model and all of those query transformations are stored there. And then the users can interact with the report that is deployed to the service through a browser. So when the user queries the report, that report is interacting with a cached version of the data that is sitting within the Power BI service, that's sitting in that data set or that data model. This is the typical deployment of Power BI. Now, when I've deployed that data is static. It's not changing when the source data changes. So there's a mechanism by which we have to keep that data up to date, and that's the refresh model. And the way that works, essentially, users are just interacting with the report and the data model on a regular basis. But on usually a scheduled basis, data is gathered back from the source system. Power BI services in the cloud, so if your data is in the cloud, it can usually reach right back to your data source. If your data is on premises, it's going to go back through the on-premises data gateway. That's just basically a piece of software that is used by all of the Power Platform, including Power Apps, and Power Automate. And this is done in a read-only fashion. So the data is gathered on a scheduled basis to keep the report up to date. Okay, so this is how things have been up until the introduction of Dataflows. They can still, but by far and away, 90–95% of the deployments still use this exact model. However, Dataflows were introduced, I guess, in preview about 1.5 years ago. And they brought in a new concept. So picture, if you will, here, we've built this report up, and we've built up our queries, and we've built up our data model, and we've deployed it out to the service. Now we go out to another user or another group of users and say, look at this wonderful report. And they say, I need access to that data, but that report isn't doing what I want it to do, or that data model isn't what I want to do. So what typically would happen is they would go out and connect to that same data, and they'd build all of that stuff up, et cetera, and deploy that as well. And there's some inefficiencies there. Some of those inefficiencies, we may be storing the same data twice that we might not need to, and we're having to go through a bunch of effort, sometimes by people maybe who shouldn't be taking that effort. Maybe they're not skilled, maybe they don't have the authority to do it. But wouldn't it be nice if we could take at least all of those transformation steps, those extract, transform, and load steps, and centralize that and just build our data models and reports from that? And that's what the data flow is all about. Here's how it works. Right within the service, we have a version of Power Query. And that Power Query can reach out to our data sources the same way we could with Power BI Desktop. And instead of putting it directly into a data model, it takes the data and stores it in behind the scenes now. You don't have to care about the fact that this is using an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage mechanism, using the common data model format. That's all happening at Microsoft. You can basically reach out in the Power BI service and build up these data flows, and the data flows are collections of entities, otherwise known as tables. And essentially you're building your queries the same way you would have built them in Power BI Desktop, only now they're centralized and they're exposed as a data flow. And a data flow now becomes a source of data within the service for other reports. So you can build data models from these data flows. I hope that's fairly clear. We're going to see a demonstration of what's going on here in just a minute. I will ask Shane if there's any questions at this point.
No questions so far, John.
Perfect.
So
All right.
looks good.
Excellent. Excellent. Either everybody totally gets it or everybody's a little glazed over this. It's early here, but it's not early there. I know that. So in any event, if you've worked with Power BI at all before and you've worked with Power Query before, you kind of have a sense of what it looks like. Now we have this concept of Power Query Online, and that's popping up in a number of places. The first place it popped up was with Dataflows. And this is how we build our data flows. And I literally updated this slide this morning because the user interface has changed much for the better. They've got the ribbon in Dataflows now, and when I last presented this in Prague in December, that was not the case. It was a very different interface, and it wasn't anywhere nearly as functional as it is today. But that's the user interface for Power Query in Power BI Desktop on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, this is the Power Query experience in the web. It's very, very similar. It's not 100% compatible. Some data sources are available to desktop that are not available to Power Query Online. Some transformations are not available in Power Query Online, but for the most part, you can actually reach in behind the scenes in Power BI Desktop, copy your advanced query, because Power Query is really just a code builder. In behind the scenes, you can go and get the code. You can paste it into Power Query Online, and it's going to work. I've not run into very many cases where that was not the case. So at one level, a data flow is just Power Query in the cloud. There are a number of nuances to it, and we're going to get to that. All right. So now let's talk about, we've talked about what a data flow is. Let's talk about how we use a data flow, how we put it actually into use. So we looked at how we build a report with Power BI Desktop before. This slide is almost identical to the basic standard report building procedure with Power BI Desktop, with one minor exception. Our data source now is the data flow itself. So we've built this data flow up with the service. We've gone out to the source data, we've transformed it, we've got it into the shape we wanted. And now that data is what feeds our report. So we've got a second Power Query step. We still have to go and get the data from that data flow and persist it in our model, or cache it in our model. And that's the classic way now, or the most standard way to work with data flows. Now I want to bring in, I'm going to start to confuse things a little bit, but there are some confusing elements within the service. A data flow is this cached data that has been prepared for us. It's the data preparation step. And if we want to use that to build our own models and reports, we'll use that. However, let's go back to that earlier contention. I see a report and it's got what I want in it, or it's got the data I want in it. It may have the model I want in it, which is the analysis that I want in it. And I may just want to have a few different visuals, or I want to take pieces of that. I can also connect to a deployed Power BI data model. And there is some confusion when we connect back to the Power BI service as a data source, how that's going to work. And that's referred to as a direct connected report. And it looks like this. When I use a direct connected Power BI report, I'm firing up Power BI Desktop, and I'm saying my data source is a pre-deployed data model, not a data flow or a data set. So data model and data set are the same thing. And I want to connect to that. And when I connect to that, I can build a report on it. I can add visuals to a canvas, but I can't do anything to the model itself. I can't make changes to the measures. I can't create new calculated measures. All I can do is use what has already been deployed for me. And that's a connected data set. So the difference between the two here, when you're actually doing a connection to them, is that one is I'm connecting my report to this data set, and the other is this is just another source of data. So a data flow is just another possible source of data for my data model. All right, so a connected data set, I'm just connecting to something that somebody's already built, and a data flow is I'm going to go out there, go get some data, and build a model. I may want to mix data flow data with data from some other root source, but those are your two choices. It depends on how you want to use it. And the thing to remember here is the way, from a security standpoint, this matters, because a data set is using the identity that you're currently using to publish to Power BI. Most people don't work with multiple tenants, but if you were to work with multiple tenants, like I do, you can log in and log out in the upper right-hand corner of your Power BI desktop screen. And the data set you could connect to is always going to be guided by the currently logged in user. You're going to see the data sets that are published to that tenant. A data flow, when I connect to a SQL database, my credentials get persisted. And this is also true for data flows. So I could be in one tenant connecting to a data flow from a different tenant and pulling that data. So you just need to be aware of that distinction. All right. So now when we use a data flow, as a user, we're still just interacting with this deployed model that people have built up. That data model is fed and updated from a data flow. That data flow itself is fed and updated from the source data, okay? So we've introduced another ETL step. There's two ETL steps. The leftmost one, that's part of the data flow, you could look at that as maybe it's curated by your enterprise. It's blessed by IT. They've built this up. And then the users can do their own transformation to bring the data into the data model. So there's some advantages, obviously, to doing that. The users only need to be able to connect to Power BI. They don't have to connect back to the source systems. They don't have to have the credentials for it. But you're introducing two levels or another level of data latency. And data latency is how long, what is the time between which the data is actually changed and when it is reflected in the underlying report. So you can see, if you're updating on a scheduled basis and it's hourly, there could easily be a 2-hour lag between when the data changes on the left-hand side and when it's reflected back into our data model here. So there are pluses and there are some minuses to using the data flow. So what I'm going to do now is walk through the steps of just going through a normal report. So anybody who's here just to see Power BI, that's going to be good for you. And then I'm going to show you what the same thing is like using a data flow. We'll build up a report from a data flow and schedule a data flow refresh. So to start with, I'm going to fire up Power BI Desktop. I should have it already running here. There we go. So this is Power BI Desktop. If your Power BI Desktop looks different than mine, it's because I've got the new ribbon experience turned on. You can turn that on in preview options in Power BI Desktop, but everything else is pretty much the same. And I'm going to start by going and getting data. And I'm going to use my SQL database that I use for gathering Twitter data. We have this, our product tygraph for Twitter that is used for events. We do this for ESPC. And it gathers Twitter conversations throughout, well, as long as it's watching. It puts them in a SQL database, and we build a Power BI report that we publish for the world. The basics of how that is built can be seen right here. We can go and get data. I'm just clicked on the get data option, and I'm going to grab a Azure SQL database. Actually, I'm going to do it. I'm going to type in Azure SQL. There we go. We have an Azure SQL database right here. I'm going to connect to it, and the first thing it wants to know is what's my Azure server, and just copying it from over here and punching it in here. And I could punch in the database. I'm going to select it in the next screen, so I'm not going to bother. And I have two options. Because we're dealing with a data source that has compute resources in behind it, I could choose to connect with direct query. I'm not going to do that because for this database, that would make my queries slow. But when I connect with direct query, I'm not storing data in a cache in the model. I'm going to be calculating or performing those queries against the source data in real time. So you only want to use that if you've got a very specific need. I'm going to go ahead and use import mode, which builds that data set that I was talking about. And we only have the one database on this particular server. I'm going to open up Twitter data. I'm going to collect tweets or select tweets. And that's the table I'm after. I'm not going to do much in the way of transformation. I'm just going to do a couple of things so you can see what. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But I'm going to, it popped up on another screen. I'm just going to bring over. So this is my Power Query Editor. And one of the first transformations I want to do is I'm going to restrict the amount of data that comes down. Maybe I don't want my data set to get too big, or I don't think older data is relevant. And I'm going to find my created at UTC time, field, which is when the tweet was created. And I'm going to filter that. I'm going to pick a little drop down here. And I'm just going to go into my date time filters. And I'm going to say, I just want everything that is after, let's see, I'm going to pick this little calendar control, and I'm just going to say after April. Let's go after April 1st. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. That's getting that data ready. And then I'm going to come over, I'm just going to scroll to the right, and you're going to see all of the tweet hashtags that we're monitoring. And we've got SharePoint, Teams, Power BI. And I'm just going to have a look. I just want to watch for this particular report, Power BI. So I'm just going to select that. I'm going to click OK. And that's all. I really should go in here and remove columns I don't need, etc. But I'm just going to go ahead, click close and apply. And this will take just a second to load in. Be a great time for any questions, Shane, if you got any.
No questions yet, John. Just a few comments saying you're explaining everything brilliantly, hence no questions. So
thank you. That's much appreciated. It's tricky. It's a complex topic. All right. So we've just imported all of those tweets since April in here. And one of the things I want to do is to create a calculated measure. I'm going to create a very simple one. I'm going to just say what are the number of tweets. So I'm just right-clicked on my tweet table here. I'm going to click on New Measure, and the measure, I get the editor screen pop up here. It says Measure Equals. I'm just going to call it Tweets Equals. And this, by the way, is DAX. This is Data Analysis Expression Language. So when I'm at this point, I am building up my data model. The previous step was doing the ETL stuff and working within Power Query. This is Power Pivot. And the DAX is where we do our multi-dimensional analysis, and we do operations across rows here, essentially. So I want to know how many rows there are. Well, I just want to count them, and I can start typing, oh, count. Oh, look, there's a function for me, count rows. I'm just going to pick that, and it's asking for a table. The table name is tweets. And very simply, that's just going to give me the number of tweets that I have. So if I select check, that's great there. I'm going to come onto my surface. My report surface, I'm going to click on tweets, and I'm going to try to click on tweets. There we go. And I'm going to pick a different visual, and that'll show me there's about 15,000 tweets total that people have tweeted about Power BI since April. And if I wanted to see it over time, let's just very quickly do this. Let's go the number of tweets. That'll be a column chart. Let's add now our created at in UTC. I'm not going to bother converting to local time to it. And you can see now we have tweets by year. I asked for a date and a time. What's happening? Well, over here, Power BI is creating automatically for me a date hierarchy. So it's broken out by year, quarter, and month. I don't want quarter. I'm going to get rid of that. So now I have year, month, and day. And I want to see how this trend has been going over time. So I'm just going to expand this over to the right-hand side. And I want to drill down on this, and I want to drill down across all my years. So I'm going to drill down all of the levels in the hierarchy, and you can see it's 2020 May there. And let's get down to the day level. And you can see those are the tweets since April 1st up until today for Power BI. From a formatting standpoint, I don't like the way the x-axis lays out like this, so I'm just going to come over here, click on my x-axis, and I'm going to turn off concatenate labels. And you can see it lays out, 2020 down below the month up here. I really like the way this lays out. And you can see here are the tweets. Maybe one more thing. Let's add whether or not the tweet was a retweet to our chart. And I've got a column for that. I'm just going to drag that, put it in the legend. And now you can see it's separated. Those are side-by-side columns. I want a stacked column. There we go. And you can see what's going on with Power BI here. All of a sudden, boom, there's a big spike on the 6th and the 7th. Well, that was the Microsoft Business Application Summit, which was Wednesday last week. So as you might expect, all of the Power BI announcements were going out. There was a big spike in the number of reports. So from here, I've got a very, very basic report. I could publish this guy. I'll publish it. I'm not going to go ahead. I'm not going to bother publishing this one right now. It'll just take too much time. But essentially, I would select a workspace to work with, and then I could go in and just work with that workspace. I'm going to hit cancel here, and that's when it gets published out to the service. And when it's published out to the service, it should. No, I didn't build a report for it already. That's okay. I would come in here and look at the same report running within the service. But what I want to do is now go through that same set of procedures, but using a data flow. So instead of using Power BI to gather that data for you, I'm going to build a data flow. So I'm in the Power BI service. This is the kind of a new interface for the Power BI service, but it's broadly available to everybody. I'm going to come in here and I'm in a workspace called Dataflow Demos, and I'm going to come up here, go to New, and I'm going to say I want a new data flow. And I'm going to build a new entity. So in data flow language, an entity is a table. There is more to it than that, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit, but for our purposes right now, we're going to go against a table. So I'm going to come over here, and these are all the data sources that are supported today by Dataflows. It's not the same list as in Power BI Desktop, but most of the important stuff is there, including Azure SQL Database. So I'm going to pick that guy. I wonder if it's still sitting in my, oh, it is, in my cache. And down here, I need to select my authentication type. Now, before when I went in with desktop, it never challenged me for credentials, and that's because I've already connected to that data source in Power BI Desktop, and my credentials have been cached. But here, the browser doesn't know that. So I have to come down here. I'm going to, in this case, pick Microsoft account. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And I'm going to use I think it's my bifocal show credentials I need to use. Yes, no, it isn't. It's my unlimited viz credentials that I need to use. So 1 second here. I get a little bit confused with it. Oh, I'm not signed in. Why not? Let me see here. Yes, let's go here. And I cannot create the connection. All right. I'm not sure why I couldn't sign in. Try that. I'm going to try it again. This may not work. No, this should work. I'm gonna keep trying, and I may bail on this part of it. I'll go in and look at another one if that's the case. I'm gonna try to connect it with my unlimited. Oh, sorry. 1 second. I'm gonna try with the name of the database, although that should not be a problem. Tweet data. And one more, but I can go and show you this anyway. I've got a predefined one ready to go. Unfortunately, something's good. Not happy with authentication for me today, but that's okay. All right, so if I come into Dataflow Demos, I'm just going to come into this. Oh, bear with me. You know, it doesn't matter how often you practice these things. Something always needs to get messed up. All right, so I've got this already built for you here with 2020 Q2 tweets. And I'm going to open up this data flow. And this is a data flow can have multiple entities within it. This one just has the one table. And I'm going to go into edit mode. And I'll walk you through the same process. So if I come up here into my source, you can see here's the same server name and the same database. And essentially I'm coming down here and I'm going to filter out my rows. If you see on what I'm doing on the right hand side, I'm clicking my steps for Power Query, because that's how Power Query works. It builds a series of steps. So instead of actually performing those steps now, I'm just going back and showing you the steps I performed. But so after the first navigation, we see all of the data that's coming back from that database. But now when I select here on the filtered rows, you can see I've already filtered on date. But I'm not going to filter on my search hashtag. I'm going to create a data flow here that I'm exposing to the enterprise. It's only going to have the last 2 months in it, and I want to do that for performance reasons as we go through the demonstration. But maybe I want to have a subset of the data here, but that's not as fine a subset as I want to build into my individual data models. I could then, go down here and rename some columns, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there was another, there's some steps that I've already performed here. We'll see if we get to it further in the presentation that I may have to walk through the same way as today. But essentially, this is what we're doing. And when we're done, all we have to do is hit save and close. Let's go ahead and do that. It's going to go ahead and validate the schemas just to make sure everything works. It's a bit of a slow process at this point. I may just go ahead and hit cancel in the interest of time because it's already, it's because it's already been built. And this data set is sitting here in this Power BI, or sorry, this data flow is sitting here in this Power BI workspace. So how do we work with the data flow? We use Power BI Desktop again. So I'm going to open up my Power BI Desktop, come back to, this is the report we already had. I'm going to create a new report. So File, New. And now instead of reaching back into Azure SQL, I'm going to connect to that data flow. And we're just loading a new instance of Power BI Desktop here. It never goes as quickly as you want it to when you're showing people, does it? Loading, and it's loading another screen. Here we go. So here's a new instance of Power BI Desktop right here. And now when I come down here to get data, I'm going to use this little drop down. And you can see in my little drop down, I've got Power BI data sets. Remember earlier when I was talking about the difference between a data set and a data flow, this is kind of where it can get confusing. You want to get the terminology right. And I'm going to connect now to this Power BI data flow. It says, please wait while we create a connection to data flows. And it knows what I had previously signed in when I worked with Dataflows again, so those credentials were persisted. If I needed to connect to a different tenant, I'd have to go and clear my credentials for that, for the Power BI Dataflow type of data source. So these are some different workspaces that are in my tenant. The workspace I'm working with is Dataflow demos. I'm going to open that up, and I've got a few data flows in here. The one I'm interested in is 2020 Q2 tweets. And if I open that up, I will see all of the entities in that data flow. So I'm going to select tweets. I'm going to go ahead and hit transform data now. And you can see we're back in that familiar Power Query editor. But the difference is going to be here in just a second, because getting the data out of the data flow is not always the fastest process.
While you're waiting, John, I have a question and some comments.
Perfect.
One person is just asking, is it possible for you to zoom in while you're on your screen?
I should have thought of that ahead of time. I don't know what, I don't have, I really got to get Zoom. So I'm afraid well, perhaps I can just try. Boom. I probably should have dropped the resolution down is what I should have done.
No problem. And then we have a question here, John. It goes, if possible, please explain the difference to import data from Excel Online and Excel from a local network, i.e. a hard drive, due to update data manually.
Yeah. All right. And it's taking just a second.
My gateway.
So this is what I can do. So I apologize for those who can't see the screen. I promise I will change that different. I think I'll mess things up if I try to change my my resolution at this point. So I'll just ask you to bear with me, and I assume the recording of this will be available afterwards. So maybe you can get in with a magnifying glass.
I see your screen just fine, so I don't see what the problem is.
All right. So for those who are experiencing a problem, my apologies. But just when we're importing, this is a slightly different topic, but I'm happy to cover it because I think it's an important one. When we're importing data from Excel, you're of course going to want to read. There we go. I think I got muted there somehow. No, the difference between importing a file, the difference getting Excel Online and Excel in the file on a file system, it boils down to, remember the earlier slide we had where Power BI, the service, is reaching out and getting that data. If that data is in a cloud source, Power BI can go directly to it. Otherwise, it needs to go through a gateway. So if the Excel file is just a file on your file system, it needs to go through a gateway to get to that. And of course, it's just a file on your file system. If your computer's off, it won't be able to do that, etc. So it's important to put the Excel file in either OneDrive for Business or in within SharePoint so that it can be automatically refreshed by the service on a regular basis. The way you connect to it, however, isn't obvious. The natural tendency is to want to use the Excel connector. I'm going to connect to Excel. Well, the Excel connector only connects to files that are on a file system. What you want to use is the SharePoint folder connector. The SharePoint folder connector will give you access to all of the files in a site collection. You can filter them down to the file you want or iterate through a series of files that you want and put them together, and then it'll automatically invoke the Excel connector and you can build what you want from that. But that approach is refreshable directly from the Power BI service. Hopefully that makes sense to all of those who weren't interested in the topic. But in any event, I've got my Power Query that is connected to my Dataflow here. And so from an operational standpoint, what I would normally do now is say, okay, I've got this data flow. It's sorted already now for the last couple of months, but I'm only interested in Power BI. Remember, just as before, I would come over here. Here's all the hashtags that we're monitoring, but now I want to sort this down to say Power BI. So I'm going to click on that and click OK. It's exactly the same process as what I was connecting to SQL before, but you'll notice I didn't have to do that initial filter. That was done at the data flow level. So I'm just kind of separating a couple of processes here. But apart from that, it's exactly the same whether you're connecting to the source SQL database or the data flow. And once you get to the next level, bringing the data flow in or bringing the data into the report, it is exactly the same. The only difference here is as we're loading the data, we're not counting rows, we're counting megabytes. And that's because that data flow is actually a collection of CSV files and you're downloading it, and we're going to iterate through that right at the end of this particular process, which takes a little bit longer than connecting to the source SQL, I must say. So while it's just finishing up, Shane, is there anything else there?
Yeah, does Dataflows work with on-premises data?
Dataflows will work with on-premises data, absolutely, but they're going to need the Power BI gateway to connect to them. You could, when we first built out that data flow, one of the questions it had was, what gateway do you want to use? And that's where we would select the gateway, and then we will be able to pull from the data sources that gateway had configured for it. This is taking just a little longer than I want it to. I'm going to let that continue. I'm going to very quickly pop back over here. And I just wanted to show you the process for updating a data flow. You've got, here's another regular data set. You would normally go into this to keep this refreshed. You could go into the, oh, there we go. It's pulling the data in, and you can see bouncing back and forth, aren't we? I'm not going to go ahead and build out the report. You saw me do that before. It would be exactly the same process here, but I can get the number of tweets, et cetera, and then I would deploy that. If I was going against a regular report, in this case it's the Titanic prediction report, I'm going to open up schedule refresh, and I just simply come down here. It's turn on the refresh. It's on a daily basis. You can see my data source credentials. In this case, my data source credentials are Power BI. That's because this is actually connecting to a data flow. This is a data set from a report that is connecting to a data flow. So it needs to use my Power BI credentials. But in addition, it's not enough to just schedule the refresh from the data flow. You have to refresh the data flow itself. So here's the data flow that we were working with just previously, 2020 Q2's tweets. And I'm going to go in, same process. I'm going to schedule the refresh. And the data flow itself has credentials. And we should see that this is got a number of, actually, this flow has a bunch of different data sources, one of which is our SQL server here. So we'd need to enter our credentials for that SQL server, and then we'd come down here to schedule the refresh, turn it on, and say, I want to update X number of times per day. All right. I'm getting a little shy on time, so we're going to stick to the slides for the rest of this. I'm just going to come back to my PowerPoint, and we're going to talk about some of the advanced features that are available to Dataflows. This one isn't as important as it looked like it was going to be a year ago. It's the ability to map to common data model entities. So Microsoft has published out a series of common data model entity types. Person would always have a name and an address, et cetera, et cetera. These are the underpinnings for the common data service for the rest of the Power Platform. They're also the underpinnings for, or they can be the underpinnings for data flows. So you can take your source data, whatever those fields may be, and map those fields to the equivalent fields in the common data model. And if you did that, let's say we built a report off of a series of entities that used a person type or a company type, that report would pull from those fields, but then we could mix and match the data from whatever source and have that data all pulled into these common data entities. So the report wouldn't have to change. The schema remains the same, but the source data may have all kinds of different schemas. Haven't seen it used an awful lot in Power BI, but it's being used rather extensively in the common data service. We have the concept of having calculated entities in data flows. In Power Query, we could have a calculated table. We could just build a table using the M language, the underlying language. That requires computation instead of just pulling data from a data source. There's a number of, so first of all, first note on here is an entity is the same thing as a table. I think I mentioned that more than once. Another way we could use calculated entities is we could refer to an entity from a different data flow in another data flow, and that's a referenced entity. A common scenario there might be I've got a date table. So to build out my date dimensions, I may want to refer to a common date table that's across the organization. And instead of recreating it in my data flow, I might want to refer to the one from a different data flow. Also, we can merge or append tables. That's doing like a join between them if we merge them, or put two tables of the same schema together. That's an append. All of these require compute, and anything that requires compute in a data flow is going to require premium or dedicated capacity, and that's a different license type, which we'll talk about here quickly in just a moment. I talked a little bit about the linked entities. The point I'm going to make with dates, for example, if we're linking entities that both have refresh schedules to them, the data flow is smart. So if I go to if I link, or if I go to refresh a dependent entity, it's going to know enough to go back and refresh the source entity first. So it's smart about how all the data is linked together. There is a view in data flows, and in fact, there is now a view in all of Power BI across the workspace that shows you how the data comes together. So it's graphical. you can see here in the example on the screen, we've got a data flow called Twitter data, and it consists of 3 entities that pull from 4 different data sources. So that first data source you can see has got a little link symbol, and that is a date dimension, exactly the same thing I was talking about before. So it's pulling from an entity in a different data flow, but it's getting most of its data from SQL Server in Azure. It's also connecting back and using cognitive services. It's performing two functions from cognitive services, one of which is to calculate sentiment. And that's showing up as a data source, AI Insights and AI Insights in Proc. That's really just 2 different functions. It's kind of the same thing, but represented here. So all of these source items have to come together to build up that data flow. And this is just a nice graphical way of showing you how everything is related together. Now, I said before, when you build a data flow, it's all being stored as a Data Lake Gen 2 storage system at Microsoft. So that's basically what you're seeing here in terms of a data flow. However, what you can do if you decide to do that is say, no, I don't want to use Microsoft's source. I want to bring my own Data Lake Gen 2 folders to the party, and I want my data from my Power Query to be stored there. Now, why would I want to do that? I would have to pay for it, right? Because it's not free. It's cheap, actually, but it's not free. Why would I do that when Microsoft will pay for it? Well, first off, I get past any limits Microsoft is imposing. So any data I'm storing in a data flow goes against my total capacity limits for my tenant in Power BI. If I put that in my own storage mechanism, it does not get charged. So I could basically blow this up as large as I want it to. And the other nice plus from it is I can now use Power Query to transform data, persist it somewhere in Azure, and then connect to that data with custom applications. I don't have to just use Power BI to access that data and build reports. So that's giving me some nice flexibility. For a number of years, people asked, could I use Power Query with anything except a report? And the answer was no. Well, now it's not. And a variation on this theme, I can have what are called external data flows. So I might be a developer, or I might have some great big production ETL process, and I don't want to go through the Power Query step. I just want to write data directly into this format, and there are libraries available that write to this format for Databricks and for data factories. Or I may want to write my own applications that persist the data in a common data model format in an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. Well, in this particular case, I can create what's called an external data flow. And the external data flow, instead of importing the data, it just connects to a pre-existing Azure Data Lake Gen 2 folder and then works as a data source in Power BI. So all that, we connect to the data flow, we go and get that data. So a lot of flexibility here as for what you can do with it. Some more stuff you can do with data flows. We can add machine learning capabilities to it. We can use cognitive services to start with. The example I would normally show, we won't have time to show it, but we could go into a data flow, add a column, and say, for this column, I want to call into sentiment analysis. And I could base the sentiment analysis on a string of text, and that will come back with a score for me. So we can introduce these sorts of capabilities as well. We can use AutoML in data flows, which is building basically saying I want to predict a score based on these parameters, and it will go out and suggest a model for you to use. We'll get into that here in just a second. Actually, let's just dive into that. It will go out and suggest an algorithm that can be used to train that data. And it will build that model, and then you can use that model in subsequent data flows to build predictive style columns or categorization style columns. You can even take that model that is built with AutoML right here in Power BI. Don't forget, Power BI, Power Query, this is great stuff for transforming and wrangling data, and that's the biggest job of any machine learning project, is getting that job done. So we can then take the model that this builds, we can then export that if we want to Azure and build an API around it, literally build applications around it. I'm going to skip past the demo because we just don't have time for it. Turning this feature on as an administrator, there's a number of things to look at. First of all, we have to turn it on in the tenant. I believe it's turned on by default now, but you can also turn it off. So if someone's turned it off, there's just simply a switch in the tenant settings. And then in particular, there are Dataflow settings, and this is where you can turn on that externalized storage I was talking about. So if you turn this on, you can connect it to an Azure Data Lake Gen 2 instance and then start storing your data flows in your own Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And then there are capacity settings for the premium features, those things that we have to have premium to use. And this is where you can go in and control how much of your premium capacity that data flows are using. So you can see right now we have switches for the total amount of memory for the underlying capacity that data flows can use, and whether or not to use the enhanced data flow compute engine. I don't need to go into that in great detail, except it brings some SQL capability and it brings some compute capability to data flows. In the future, this is what's going to be used to allow direct query access to data flows, that ability to get the data from the source in essentially real time. Now, I've touched on premium and the need for premium for some of these features, so I want to cover off very quickly what that's all about, because there's confusion in this space for Power BI in the licensing world. So Power BI licensing comes in a couple of flavors. By default, there's the free version, and then there's a pro version. You can have a pro license. You get a pro license if you have E5 Office or Microsoft 365, or you can buy it separately, and it's $9.99 a month. In essence, you can do everything. You can access all of the capabilities of Power BI that don't have anything to do with sharing with the free version. You need Pro in order to share reports. And the classic here is if I build a report and I publish it out and I want to share it with someone, I have to have Pro, and so does the person consuming the report. Unless that report or that data set has been published to a workspace that is in dedicated capacity or premium capacity. So there's a difference here. Free and Pro cover user licensing, and dedicated capacity is something the enterprise buys. It's not really a licensing model. But when we have dedicated capacity, in essence, we're buying virtual machines and CPU cycles and memory in Azure. And when we tie a workspace to this capacity, suddenly you can share with whomever. So the person consuming the report no longer needs a license to be able to consume the report. You still need a pro license to publish it, but the consumer does not need it. And it lights up all of these other features that require compute, basically because you have to manage your own compute cycles. And there are some other changes that premium capacity brings to the table, like 48 refreshes per day, larger model size limits, etc. It can be bought 3 different ways. I don't know that anybody on the call really cares too much about it. Premium is by far and away the more common one, but if you're a developer, you probably want to look at the A style license, and you buy that through Azure. I've been talking obviously about data flows throughout this whole thing. What do you need? What can you do for free with data flows? An awful lot. And what do you need premium for? I kind of highlighted as we went through, but just to reiterate, computed entities, incremental refresh, we haven't talked about that. That's the ability to just bring in changes from the source data as opposed to all of the source data every time. Parallel execution of transform, having multiple things run at the same time. And linked entities all require premium. The AutoML stuff that it's not on this chart either. The auto machine learning and the cognitive services also require premium. I need to update this chart accordingly. So with that, a couple of minutes left. Hopefully there's a couple of questions. We'll just go into wrap up mode. Another pitch for the podcast, bifocal.show. And I'm going to throw the floor open for the 1 minute we have remaining to questions.
Great stuff, John. Yeah, thanks for a great presentation. Yeah, we do have a few questions, and I'll just kind of quickly go through them.
I'll stay as long as anybody wants to hear for the questions. So.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, so you just answered there was some questions about cost, which you've just answered. And then we have a question here of, is it possible to set relationships between tables in different data flows?
Relationships between tables in different data flows. I don't you know what? I don't know the answer to that. The examples I've always used have been within the same data flow, so the same entities within the same data flow. Through yes is the answer, actually, because you could use a linked entity to do that. So if you have a linked entity, you have complete access to that source entity, so that'll be in the different data flow. And yes, you can do calculated. You can do merges between a linked entity and a regular entity. So the answer is yes.
Okay. Could you provide examples of custom applications?
A custom, so an example of a custom application. So if I had, I'm trying, one I've actually done, and that's using an externalized data flow. But in terms of consuming, you may have data coming from some source that is in, you know, I'm just going to give you the example I did because that's what I could do off the top of my head. We built out a version of tyGraph. We haven't gone to market with it for a couple of reasons, but we're using something called Graph Data Connect. And Graph Data Connect pulls all of the inventory data from the Microsoft Graph for today email. So I can go and get a dump of all of the email in the organization, all of the contacts for an organization. And that gets landed in a data lake or a blob store as JSON files. And we used what did we use? A data factory, sorry. Azure Data Factory to take that data and put it in common data model format. And then we're able to connect up Power BI as a data flow, an externalized data flow, to that common data model format folder, and then build reports right off the top of that. So we built out an application in this case that would let you browse all of the contacts within an organization. So with Outlook, you're building out your own. Everybody's contact list is personal to them. I'm not talking about the GACs, the general organizational stuff, but everybody has their own list of contacts. So with this application, we could basically build a contact list for the organization of everybody's contacts. So you may have 20 instances of a single individual coming from 20 different people, but this would allow us to figure out what's fresh, what's up to date, what's not, etc. I don't know if that's the best example of a custom application, but it's one I can think of off the top of my head.
Sure. Can you tell us more about data catalog?
I don't know very much about the Azure Data Catalog. The Azure Data Catalog, I haven't messed with it very much. It's basically a curated set of data. It's basically pointing you at various data sources. But beyond that, so where you would use it is you may build a data flow to connect to that data catalog. If you wanted to expose that out or perform transformations that were available to the overall organization. But the data catalog should be available to Power BI data sources to build out their own reports as well. So in some ways, it kind of performs the same function as a data flow in that it's a curated set of data, but in this case, it's curated by Microsoft, whereas your data flow could be curated by the organization. That's the best I can do off the top of my head without knowing that much about Azure Data Catalog.
Okay, great. And then there's lots of comments and pieces coming in saying, thanks for a great presentation, brilliant presentation, great webinar, John. Great to hear you again, John.
Oh, thanks.
So lots of love on this side of the world for you, John. By the
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, yeah, I haven't been able to come and see that part of the world. I won't be able to for a little while yet. Hoping to soon. Well, counting on it in the fall.
That's it. John, on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shane. Really, really appreciate it, and happy to be on anytime.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Okay, everybody, this is the end of the webinar for today. Please see sharepointeurope.com for further details of all upcoming webinars, or visit our resource center for all previous episodes. A big thank you again to our webinar presenter, John P. White. That is all for today. Thank you for joining us. Take care and goodbye.